The psychology of inner invincibility and authentic power. Have you ever watched someone who seems completely unaffected by criticism, drama, or other people's opinions? They move through life with a quiet confidence that appears almost supernatural. Nothing seems to disturb their inner peace. No insult penetrates their armor. No rejection shakes their foundation. This isn't arrogance or coldness. It's something far more profound. Carl Jung, the legendary Swiss psychologist, understood that true emotional invincibility comes not from building walls around your heart, but from developing such a complete relationship with yourself that external circumstances lose their power to control your inner state. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it's not about becoming callous or disconnected from others. Instead, it's about achieving what Jung called psychological independence, a state where your emotional well-being depends primarily on your relationship with yourself rather than on how others treat you or what they think about you. The journey to emotional untouchability is one of the most powerful transformations a person can undergo. It represents the difference between living as a victim of circumstances and living as the author of your own emotional experience. Understanding emotional vulnerability. Before we can understand how to become emotionally untouchable, we must first understand why most people are so emotionally vulnerable in the first place. Jung identified several psychological patterns that keep people trapped in cycles of emotional reactivity and dependence on external validation. The first pattern is what Jung called unconscious identification. Most people unconsciously identify with their roles, their achievements, their relationships, or their social status. When these external identities are threatened or criticized, they feel as if their very self is under attack. A criticism of their work becomes a personal assault. A relationship ending feels like a fundamental failure of their worth as a human being. Jung observed that this identification with external factors creates what he termed psychological inflation and deflation. When external circumstances go well, the person feels inflated, overly confident and dependent on continued success. When things go poorly, they experience deflation, depression, anxiety, and a sense of worthlessness. This emotional roller coaster continues as long as the person's sense of self remains tied to external factors. The second pattern is the unconscious need for approval and validation. Jung understood that most people carry within them what he called complexes, autonomous psychological patterns that operate independently of conscious control. The approval complex drives people to constantly seek validation from others, making them emotionally dependent on positive feedback and devastated by criticism or rejection. The third pattern involves what Jung called projection. When people haven't done the work of understanding their own psychological patterns, they unconsciously project their internal conflicts onto others. This creates a constant state of reactivity where other people's behavior seems to have tremendous power over their emotional state. The foundation, self-knowledge. Jung believed that emotional invulnerability begins with radical self-knowledge. This isn't the surface-level self-awareness that comes from personality tests or casual introspection, but a deep, unflinching examination of your own psychological patterns, motivations, and unconscious drives. The first step in developing this self-knowledge is what Jung called ShadowWork, the process of recognizing and integrating the aspects of yourself that you've repressed or denied. Everyone has a shadow, parts of their personality they consider unacceptable or that don't fit their idealized self-image. When you refuse to acknowledge your shadow, you remain vulnerable to others who might trigger or expose these hidden aspects. For example, if you've repressed your capacity for anger while maintaining an image of yourself as always calm and reasonable, someone who calls you angry or aggressive will hit a deep nerve. Your emotional reaction will be disproportionate because they've touched something you're desperately trying to hide, even from yourself. However, when you've done shadow work and can honestly acknowledge all aspects of yourself, including the parts you don't particularly like, criticism loses much of its sting. If someone calls you selfish and you've already examined your own capacity for selfishness, accepted it as part of your human complexity, and learned to manage it consciously, their criticism becomes simply information rather than an attack on your carefully constructed self-image. Jung emphasized that shadow integration doesn't mean acting on every impulse or becoming morally relativistic. Instead, it means developing a conscious relationship with all aspects of yourself, so that you're no longer at the mercy of unconscious patterns or desperate to maintain an unrealistic self-image. The second aspect of self-knowledge involves understanding your complexes, those autonomous psychological patterns that can hijack your emotional responses. Common complexes include the need for approval, the drive for power, the fear of abandonment, and various parental complexes that replay childhood dynamics in adult relationships. When you can identify your complexes and understand how they operate, you gain tremendous power over your emotional reactions. Instead of being unconsciously driven by these patterns, you can observe them in action and choose how to respond. This doesn't mean the complexes disappear, but rather that you develop what Jung called complex consciousness, the ability to see them clearly and not be controlled by them. Developing inner authority. One of the key elements of emotional untouchability is developing what Jung called inner authority, a solid sense of your own values, perceptions, and worth that doesn't depend on external validation or agreement. Most people operate from external authority, constantly looking to others to tell them what to think, how to feel, and whether they're valuable. Inner authority develops through a process Jung called individuation, the psychological journey toward becoming a complete, unique individual, rather than simply a product of social conditioning and others' expectations. This process requires separating your authentic self from the various roles and personas you've adopted to fit in or gain approval. The development of inner authority begins with questioning the beliefs, values, and opinions you've inherited from your family, culture, and social environment. Jung didn't advocate for rejecting all external influences, but rather for consciously choosing which influences to accept based on your own experience and judgment, rather than simply absorbing them unconsciously. This questioning process often creates temporary discomfort because it means letting go of the security that comes from belonging to a group or following established authorities. However, the psychological freedom that results is worth the temporary uncertainty. When you know what you believe and why you believe it, other people's disagreement or disapproval loses much of its power to disturb you. Inner authority also involves developing trust in your own perceptions and intuition. Jung observed that many people doubt their own experience when it conflicts with what others tell them they should think or feel. This self-doubt creates vulnerability because it means you're constantly seeking external confirmation of your internal reality. Developing trust in your own perception doesn't mean becoming closed to other perspectives or feedback. Instead, it means having a solid enough sense of your own experience that you can consider others' input without being destabilized by it. You can take in information, evaluate it against your own understanding, and integrate what's useful while discarding what doesn't serve you. The art of non-attachment. Jung understood that attachment, the psychological dependence on specific outcomes, relationships, or circumstances, is one of the primary sources of emotional suffering. The more attached you are to something, the more power it has to hurt you when it changes or disappears. Emotional untouchability requires developing what Jung called psychological non-attachment, the ability to care deeply about things while not being emotionally dependent on them. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. Non-attachment doesn't mean not caring or becoming emotionally numb. Instead, it means loving and caring from a place of inner fullness rather than inner need. For example, you can love someone deeply while not being attached to their response to your love. You can care about your work while not being attached to specific recognition or outcomes. You can have preferences and desires while not being emotionally devastated when things don't go according to your plans. This non-attachment develops naturally as you strengthen your relationship with yourself and develop inner authority. When your sense of worth and emotional well-being comes primarily from within, you're less dependent on external circumstances aligning with your preferences. Jung also emphasized the importance of accepting impermanence, the reality that everything in life changes. Most emotional suffering comes from resisting this fundamental truth. When you can accept that relationships change, circumstances shift, and even your own thoughts and feelings are temporary, You develop a kind of psychological flexibility that makes you much less vulnerable to emotional turbulence. Mastering emotional regulation. True emotional untouchability isn't about suppressing emotions or becoming stoically indifferent. Jung understood that emotions provide valuable information about your internal state and your relationship with your environment. The goal isn't to eliminate emotions, but to develop mastery over them. Emotional regulation begins with what Jung called affect tolerance, the ability to experience intense emotions without being overwhelmed by them or immediately acting on them. Most people have a low tolerance for difficult emotions like anger, fear, or sadness, so they either suppress these feelings or act impulsively to escape them. Developing affect tolerance means learning to sit with difficult emotions, observe them with curiosity rather than judgment, and allow them to move through you without being controlled by them. This skill develops through practice and requires a fundamental shift in your relationship with your emotional experience. Jung also emphasized the importance of understanding the difference between emotions and emotional reactions. Emotions are natural responses to internal and external stimuli. They provide information and energy for appropriate action. Emotional reactions, on the other hand, are often unconscious, disproportionate responses driven by complexes, projections, or past experiences. When someone criticizes you, for example, you might feel hurt or disappointed. These are natural emotions that provide information about the situation. However, if you react with rage, defensiveness, or a desire for revenge, you're likely being driven by unconscious patterns rather than responding appropriately to the present situation. Learning to distinguish between emotions and reactions allows you to honor your feelings while choosing your responses consciously. This creates tremendous emotional freedom because you're no longer at the mercy of automatic patterns. Creating psychological boundaries. Jung understood that healthy boundaries are essential for emotional well-being. However, he distinguished between defensive boundaries that keep others out and conscious boundaries that define where you end and others begin. Defensive boundaries often create isolation and prevent genuine connection, while conscious boundaries actually make deeper relationships possible. Psychological boundaries involve understanding what is yours to carry and what belongs to others. Many emotionally vulnerable people take on others' emotions, problems, and opinions as if they were their own. This creates constant emotional turbulence because they're carrying psychological material that doesn't belong to them. Developing healthy boundaries means learning to distinguish between empathy and emotional fusion. Empathy involves understanding and caring about others' experiences while maintaining your own emotional center. Emotional fusion involves taking on others' emotional states as if they were your own, which creates confusion and instability. Jung also emphasized the importance of boundaries around your attention and energy. Emotionally untouchable people are very selective about what they allow into their psychological space. They don't engage with every criticism, opinion, or drama that comes their way. Instead, they consciously choose what deserves their attention based on their values and priorities. This selectivity isn't about being dismissive or uncaring. It's about recognizing that your attention and emotional energy are precious resources that should be invested wisely. When you're clear about your boundaries, you can engage more fully with the people and situations that truly matter while remaining unaffected by the rest. The practice of detached observation. One of Jung's most powerful techniques for developing emotional invulnerability is what he called detached observation, the ability to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and reactions with the curiosity of a scientist studying an interesting phenomenon. Most people are completely identified with their thoughts and emotions. When they think something, they assume it's true. When they feel something, they assume it's justified. This identification creates vulnerability because every thought and emotion feels personally significant and urgent. Detached observation involves developing what Jung called the observing self, a part of your consciousness that can watch your own psychological processes without being caught up in them. From this perspective, you can notice thoughts and emotions arising without immediately believing them or acting on them. For example, if someone criticizes your work, you might observe, "I notice I'm feeling defensive right now." There's anger arising, and thoughts about how this person doesn't understand me. I can feel the impulse to argue or prove my point. This kind of observation creates space between you and your automatic reactions, allowing you to choose how to respond. This practice requires developing what Jung called psychological distance, the ability to step back from your immediate experience and observe it objectively. This doesn't mean disconnecting from your emotions or becoming coldly analytical. Instead, it means maintaining enough psychological space to see clearly what's happening without being overwhelmed by it. Building unshakable self-worth. Perhaps the most crucial element of emotional untouchability is developing what Jung called unconditional self-worth, a sense of your own value that doesn't depend on external achievements, relationships, or approval. This is different from self-esteem, which fluctuates based on circumstances and performance. Unconditional self-worth is based on the recognition that your value as a human being is inherent and unchangeable. It doesn't increase when you succeed or decrease when you fail. It's not dependent on others' opinions or treatment of you. This kind of self-worth provides an unshakable foundation that external circumstances cannot touch. Developing unconditional self-worth often requires healing old wounds and limiting beliefs about yourself. Many people carry unconscious beliefs that they must earn love, prove their worth, or be perfect to be valuable. These beliefs create constant vulnerability because they tie self-worth to external factors. Jung emphasized that unconditional self-worth doesn't come from positive thinking or affirmations, but from deep psychological work that addresses the root causes of self-doubt and insecurity. This often involves examining childhood experiences, cultural conditioning, and unconscious beliefs that have shaped your relationship with yourself. The paradox of caring without needing. One of the most sophisticated aspects of emotional untouchability is learning to care deeply while not needing specific outcomes. This paradox allows you to engage fully with life and relationships while maintaining your emotional center, regardless of what happens. Jung understood that the capacity to care without needing develops naturally as you strengthen your relationship with yourself and develop inner authority. When you're emotionally complete within yourself, you can offer love, care, and attention to others as a gift rather than as part of a transaction. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent or detached in relationships. Instead, it means loving from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. You can be deeply invested in others' well-being while not being dependent on their response to your care. You can have strong preferences about how situations unfold while remaining emotionally stable when things don't go as you hoped. Integration and daily practice. Becoming emotionally untouchable isn't a destination but an ongoing practice. Jung emphasized that psychological development is a lifelong journey that requires consistent attention and effort. The skills and insights that create emotional invulnerability must be applied regularly in daily life. The integration process involves taking the psychological insights you've gained and applying them in real-world situations. This means practicing shadow awareness when you feel triggered, maintaining boundaries when others try to manipulate or control you, and observing your reactions with detachment when faced with criticism or conflict. Jung also emphasized the importance of what he called psychological hygiene, regular practices that maintain your emotional and mental well-being. This might include meditation, journaling, therapy, or other practices that help you stay connected to your inner authority and maintain clarity about your psychological patterns. The goal isn't to become perfect or to never have emotional reactions. Instead, it's to develop such a solid relationship with yourself that external circumstances have less and less power to disturb your inner peace. You become like a mountain, able to weather any storm while remaining fundamentally unmoved. Living as an emotionally untouchable person. When you've developed true emotional untouchability, your entire approach to life changes. You move through the world with a quiet confidence that doesn't need to prove itself. You can listen to criticism without becoming defensive, face rejection without feeling worthless, and deal with conflict without losing your center. This doesn't make you cold or uncaring. In fact, emotional untouchability often makes you more compassionate and effective in your relationships because you're not constantly protecting yourself or seeking validation. You can be present with others' pain without taking it on as your own. You can offer support without becoming enmeshed in their problems. People often notice something different about emotionally untouchable individuals. There's a stillness and presence that comes from not being constantly reactive to external circumstances. They seem to operate from a deeper place, unruffled by the dramas and turbulence that overwhelm others. This inner stability allows for more authentic relationships because you're not performing or pretending to gain approval. You can be genuinely yourself because your worth isn't dependent on others' acceptance. Paradoxically, this often makes you more attractive to others because authenticity and emotional stability are rare and valuable qualities. Jung understood that emotionally untouchable people serve a crucial function in society. They provide an example of what's possible when someone has done the deep psychological work of becoming a complete individual. They serve as anchors in a world of emotional turbulence, offering stability and perspective to those around them. The ultimate freedom. The journey to emotional untouchability ultimately leads to what Jung considered the greatest freedom available to human beings: psychological independence. This is the freedom to be yourself regardless of circumstances, to choose your responses rather than being driven by unconscious patterns, and to find peace and fulfillment from within rather than depending on external validation. This freedom doesn't come easily or quickly. It requires facing difficult truths about yourself, questioning beliefs and patterns you've held for years, and developing new ways of relating to yourself and others. It often involves periods of loneliness and uncertainty as you separate from old patterns and dependencies. However, the reward is immense. When you become emotionally untouchable, you gain access to your full psychological power and authentic self-expression. You can love deeply without fear, pursue your goals without being paralyzed by others' opinions, and navigate life's inevitable challenges with grace and resilience. Jung saw this transformation as the natural goal of human psychological development. He believed that everyone has the potential to become emotionally invulnerable through the patient work of self-understanding and conscious development. The question isn't whether it's possible, but whether you're willing to undertake the journey. Most people remain emotionally vulnerable throughout their lives because they're unwilling to do the difficult inner work required for transformation. They prefer the familiar pain of reactivity and dependence to the unknown territory of psychological freedom. But for those who are ready to claim their emotional power, Jung's insights provide a clear path forward. The man who walks away in our original story represents this transformation completed. He's not running from life or relationships. He's operating from such a solid foundation that external circumstances no longer have the power to destabilize him. He's become emotionally untouchable, not through hardness or indifference, but through the deep psychological work of becoming a complete individual, ready to claim your emotional power. The journey to becoming emotionally untouchable starts with a single decision: the commitment to know yourself completely and develop an unshakable relationship with who you truly are. If this deep dive into Jung's wisdom resonated with you, there's so much more to explore. Subscribe to School of Philosophy for weekly insights that will transform how you understand yourself and navigate life's challenges. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss our latest explorations into the human psyche, ancient wisdom, and practical philosophy for modern living. Your journey to psychological mastery starts with a single click. Welcome to the School of Philosophy family.